Hello, I'm Sam from Sound on Sound magazine, and I've made this video to talk a bit about Universal Audio's Luna recording system. It is the most talked about piece of music software I can remember for a long time. It was announced at the NAMM show back in January, and it's been rush released now as a thank you from UA to their loyal users to help them get through the coronavirus crisis. I've had a beta of Luna for just a couple of days, and I will be writing a full review for the magazine shortly. But before that, I thought I'd share what I've learned so far in this video, and I'm going to be doing that through the medium of country music.
I was born in a barn. I was born in a barn. I spent 19 years in the Tennessee School of Charm.
So, Born in a Barn is a song that I wrote in order to try out some of the features of Luna, and in this video I'm going to show you how I used those features to create this timeless masterpiece. But before that, what is Luna? Well, the one thing we know from Universal Audio is that Luna definitely isn't a DAW. But for something that definitely isn't a DAW, Luna does have quite a lot in common with things that probably are DAWs. In particular, it does share a lot of features with Pro Tools, which is certainly a DAW. And one fairly striking similarity is that the keyboard shortcuts are mostly identical, even down to quite niche things like Shift-Alt-3 to consolidate a region. So if you're already a Pro Tools user, you'll have that muscle memory and you can carry it forward into Luna. What's also quite like Pro Tools is that Luna only has two main views. There's a timeline view, which we can see here, and a mixer view. By default, there's only one Luna window open and it can show either the mixer or the timeline, but you can have as many Luna windows as you like. They're called alternates, and if you want, you can have 3 or 4 of them all showing different parts of the mixer or different parts of the timeline, which is great. There's also a nice feature called workflows, and this adapts the timeline window to show controls relevant to what you're doing. So if, for instance, we select the edit workflow, we now have single-click access to a bunch of key audio editing functions. And then if I select MIDI, I get a tiny little keyboard, which I can also play from my QWERTY keyboard. In another way, Luna is a little bit Ableton Livey as well, because instead of choosing plugins and presets from big long pop-up menus, everything happens in this browser window at the left of the screen. Obviously, when I try and choose a plugin, the UA plugins appear at the top, but you can search by name to narrow the field down. You can also fold and unfold the list by manufacturer, and so on. The same goes for other things that come in long lists, like automation parameters. So there are some similarities with existing programs, some of them even DAWs. But there's also plenty that's fresh and new in Luna, and that includes one particularly interesting feature which I'm going to save to the end of this video. In fact, you're going to have to listen to my country song at least twice before I describe it. Now, under normal circumstances, Born in a Barn is the kind of song you'd want to track with a band, if at all. But these are not normal circumstances, so instead I'm using it to try out some of the virtual instruments that come with Luna. Now, some of these are paid options like the Ravel Grand Piano and the Virtual Minimoog, which is great. But in this song, I'm only using the instrument that comes free with Luna. It's called Shape, and it's what we used to call a rompler, a fairly basic sample playback instrument that does bread and butter sounds. As far as I can see, a lot of the content is licensed from third parties. So in this track, I'm using a drum kit from Ocean Way Drums, a MIDI bass guitar from Orange Tree Samples, a Hammond organ, and a synth lead in the middle 8. It's not amazingly comprehensive, and the editing options are fairly limited, but the sounds are good, and it definitely gets the job done. To drive virtual instruments, we need MIDI, and Luna does MIDI. It does MIDI rather like Pro Tools used to do MIDI, so there's no separate MIDI editor, there's no drum view or any of that fancy stuff, you just edit your MIDI data right in the track. Personally, I'm fine with that, and actually Luna has a couple of really nice touches that make it easier. So if you click Fit, for example, it will automatically adjust the vertical zoom on the track so that all the selected notes are visible. And then, even better, if you click Fold, it will hide any pitches that don't actually have notes assigned to them. That's great for editing drums, but you could also use it by drawing in a scale and then hitting Fold, and then you'd know that any notes you added later on were going to be in the key of the song. So I've got my MIDI rhythm section, but even I have standards, and I'm not going to inflict MIDI guitars on the world. So it's time to dig out my trusty Strat. Now, if I was recording in a conventional DAW, I'd be doing a lot of alt-tabbing back and forth between the DAW and the console utility that manages the Apollo Twin here. If I set up a plug-in chain in the console, I'd later have to recreate that chain in Pro Tools if I wanted to hear it on playback. So one of the key drivers behind the development of Luna is that UA wanted to get rid of that two-stage workflow and bring everything together in one application. So the Luna mixer actually replaces console, and if we look at an audio track in the Luna mixer, there's a slot at the top for a Unison plugin. Those are the UA plugins that actually reconfigure the input circuitry on the Apollo as well as applying signal processing. So if you use them, the effect is always printed. In between the Unison and the insert slots, you've also got a slot labelled tape, where you can insert a virtual tape machine. Luna actually comes with a free one called Oxide, and that sounds really good to me, but if you want something a bit more controllable and fancier, you can also upgrade to UA's Studer A800. And as well as audio and instrument tracks, there's a third track type in Luna, which is the bus track. Now these can be used for subgrouping, so in this example I've got all my guitar tracks going to the guitar bus here, but you can also send to them to add reverb and so on for auxiliary effects. What you can also do is put up to 2 buses into this accelerated real-time monitoring mode, and what that does is switch the bus into a low latency monitoring path so that you can hear any sources routed through it in real time. So as far as low latency monitoring is concerned, Luna isn't quite like Pro Tools HDX where the entire mixer operates with low latency, but it does a pretty good job of making sure the inputs you need are in the low latency path, and of course you can still do multiple cue mixes like you could in console. Soloing buses works like it does in Cubase, for example. So if I solo a bus, you'll hear everything that's routed to it. But the really cool thing about buses in Luna is this neat spill button. If I hit spill on a bus, it collapses the mixer and shows only the tracks that are routed to that bus. In effect, it's like VCA spill, except without VCAs, which is great. I love spill, I never use VCAs. Really simple, really effective. Now, appropriately enough, buses don't have the tape option, but what they have instead is emulated Neve console summing. That's another paid-for upgrade, but it makes a surprisingly big difference to the sound, especially if you switch this virtual impedance control here. Now in this mix, I've got everything routed to a single bus at the end, the all bus, and you can hear how much of a difference this impedance switch makes when I switch it.
I guess you don't like my taste in music. I guess you don't share my views.
Another thing that's really nice about the console summing here is this trim option. I don't know about you, but I often find that I overload my buses by having the channel faders up too high. Going back into the mix and turning them all down is tedious, so instead all I need to do is just turn down this little trim control. Very quick. Now, once you've recorded audio, of course, you'll probably want to edit it. And first of all, you might want to comp together a performance from multiple takes. These are called versions in Luna, and they're available on both audio and MIDI tracks. It's very simple. You simply display the versions panel in the edit view and then you select which one you want to listen to. So as you can see, I've absolutely nailed this banjo part in just the 11 takes. And if I want to comp them together, I just select a take, find a bit I like, copy it and paste it onto the master take. So simple, fairly old school, but very effective. Actual audio editing is a bit like a streamlined version of what you have in Pro Tools, except you don't have multiple tools to choose from here, you just have a single smart tool. The function of this tool is context dependent depending on where you hover it over a region. So if, for example, I hover it over the end of the region, it turns into a trimmer and allows me to move the end of the region in and out. And if you've ever used elastic audio in Pro Tools, then warping in Luna will be pretty similar. It turns out that when I try and play slide guitar, I can either play it in time or I can play it in tune, but not both. So what you see here is the upper track is the original take, which is out of time. And on the lower take, I've used the warp markers in Luna to move it around and put it into time. It sounds great, actually. There's no artifacts that I can hear. I'm using the monophonic algorithm here because it's a more or less monophonic part, but there are also rhythmic and polyphonic algorithms and a Verispeed one too. The only downside to this at the moment is that it's a purely manual process. You can't take these warp markers and quantize them automatically. I hope UA will add that fairly soon. One thing Pro Tools has that Luna doesn't have is edit and mix groups, and there's no real equivalent that I can see in Luna. In fact, I haven't quite got my head yet around the way that editing works across multiple tracks. But I think the basic idea is that it's supposed to follow selection. So if, for example, I have these two tracks selected and use the trimmer to trim the ends of these regions, they should both follow one another. Now, selection is an area that's tripped me up a few times because I keep finding that tracks are selected when I thought they weren't. And I also find it slightly hard to get used to the visual logic here, where the tracks that look selected to me are actually the ones that aren't. The ones with the black background in the track header are selected, the ones with the coloured background are not selected. So once you've edited your parts, you might want to add some automation, as I've done on this vocal track here. And the process of drawing in automation in Luna is really smooth. You use the modifier keys to change the function of the cursor, so you can add nodes, you can easily switch to moving them around, or you can pick up whole chunks of automation and move them around. And better still, if you're one of those people who likes to write automation by moving faders, then Luna supports not only latch and touch modes, but also trim automation. That is a really cool advanced feature, and in effect it allows you to write an automation pass and then zero the faders and write another pass over the top of it and have it summed with the original pass. That's really useful if, for instance, you've got a lot of detailed automation and then you decide that some section of the song needs to come down just a dB or something like that. So it's great that Luna has trim automation built in right from the start. There is one fly in the automation ointment though, which is that Luna doesn't actually support any hardware control surfaces at the moment, so although it has a touch mode, there's nothing you can touch except the mouse. Hopefully that will change soon. In general, in fact, it is important to remember that Luna is a version 1.0 application, so there are quite a few things missing. There's no continuous scrolling, there's no video window, there's no score editor, there's no surround support. But I think the omission that most people will feel the most keenly is the lack of a freeze or bounce in place function. I'm sure there will be a lot of people like me on the road who are using Luna with a twin or even an arrow, and sooner or later you are going to run out of DSP resources, probably sooner. Even on this mix, which only has half a dozen audio tracks, I'm pretty much maxing out the 4 Shark chips in my twin here. And you have to remember that all the new stuff in Luna, like the virtual instruments and the Neve summing, is actually native. It doesn't even run on the DSP. Talking of resources, I said earlier on there was one feature of Luna that I thought was particularly interesting. It's completely independent of sample rate. A Luna project doesn't have a sample rate as such. It can contain audio at any sample rate, and you can actually change sample rate on the fly while a project is open. So, for instance, you could record key parts at 96k and then do your masked backing vocals at 44.1 to save resources, or you could start a project at 96k and then switch to a lower sample rate for mixing to avoid maxing out your DSP chips. So one of the great things about working at SOS is that if I want to improve my mediocre country rock songs by adding some really good lead guitar, I can call up my boss and say, "Dave, could you play some guitar for me?" And Dave Lockwood was kind enough to send me this file, so I don't have to worry about what sample rate and bit depth he uses. I can just drop it straight onto a Luna track and go. Now that's cool. But the audio engine has an even cooler trick up its sleeve. I've recorded everything in this project at 144 BPM. And I don't know about you, but I quite often get quite far down the production process and then find myself thinking, you know what, this is a bit slow. I really don't want to have to go back to Dave at that stage and go, you know that solo you sweated over? And in Luna, I don't need to. I can just change the project tempo, and then when I play it back,
I was born in a barn. I was born in a barn.
So that's pretty amazing. It's just adapted my entire project to the new tempo on the fly. And here I'm using the constant tempo option, but there's also tape style varispeed with pitch change if I want to do that instead. They both sound really good, and that's just a really impressive feature. There is one downside to this. The Luna audio engine is quite demanding on the system resources. I can play quite a lot of tracks back in other DAWs, more so than I can in Luna. So I think you're going to need a reasonably modern machine to get the best from Luna. One final interesting feature about Luna is that there's no save function. Everything that you do is written to the disk immediately, so you never stand to lose any changes, which is cool. However, at the moment, there's also no easy way to save a version as a sort of waypoint that you can return to later. You can save a copy, but that duplicates all the audio content in the project, so your drives are going to fill up pretty fast. So that's Luna. What's the verdict? Well, you'll have to wait for my full review for a detailed verdict, but I think it's fair to say that when UA say that Luna definitely isn't a DAW, they doth protest a bit too much, because it definitely is a DAW. It's a young DAW, but it's one that has a really clear identity, and it has some very advanced features that are going to make other manufacturers sit up and think. And of course, if you have a Mac and an Apollo already, Luna is actually free, though you are definitely going to want to buy the Neve summing option. If you jump from another DAW, there will be things you'll miss, but getting up and running is pretty easy and really fast, and I think there's a lot of promise here. So watch this space. And best of all, it's really great for country music.
I was born